The silence hit harder than any turbulence I'd ever felt at 30,000 feet. One moment I was standing by the dessert table at our family reunion in Millfield Gardens, laughing with my old squadron buddy about basic training horror stories, and the next moment my sister Cassandra had her hands on my chest, shoving me backward with a force that sent me stumbling into the chocolate fountain. "You think you're so special because you wore a uniform?" she hissed, her voice carrying across the entire pavilion filled with aunts, uncles, and cousins who had gone deadly quiet. "You think that makes you better than the rest of us who stayed here and actually contributed to this family?" Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. But what happened next? What I saw when I looked up from the chocolate dripping down my dress blues, that's what changed everything. Because standing behind Cassandra, forming a perfect semicircle like we'd practiced 1,000 times in formation drills, were 7 of my Air Force squadron members. Not just any squadron members. These were women who had flown combat missions over the deserts of Kandahar, who had pulled wounded soldiers from burning helicopters, who had earned their stripes through blood, sweat, and the kind of courage that most people only read about in history books. Technical Sergeant Riley Blackstone stepped forward first, her 6-foot frame casting a shadow over my sister's suddenly pale face. Behind her, Staff Sergeant Amber Thornfield cracked her knuckles, the same hands that had once performed emergency surgery on a fellow airman during a sandstorm with nothing but a field kit and pure determination. My name is Captain Jade Winters, and if you're watching this, stay with me because this story is about what happens when a family that's spent 28 years making you feel small suddenly realizes they've been underestimating a woman who commands respect from some of the most fearless warriors in the United States military. See, Cassandra thought she was dealing with the same quiet little sister who used to cry when she stole my toys, who would hide in her room when family arguments got too loud, who always apologized first even when she wasn't wrong. What she didn't realize was that the woman standing in front of her had spent the last decade learning how to command a squadron of elite airmen, how to make life-or-death decisions under pressure, and most importantly, how to never back down when someone tries to intimidate her or the people under her protection. The chocolate fountain incident wasn't just sibling rivalry gone wrong. It was the moment 28 years of family dynamics collided headfirst with military precision and loyalty that ran deeper than blood. You see, my squadron wasn't just at this reunion by coincidence. We were there because I'd invited them to Millfield, this little town in northern Colorado where I grew up. Because after everything we'd been through together, the deployments to Bagram Air Base, the rescue missions that left us with PTSD and metal ribbons in equal measure, the nights when we held each other together when the nightmares got too real, I wanted them to meet the family I'd talked about for years. I wanted to show them the place that shaped me, the people who made me who I was before the Air Force taught me who I could become. What I didn't expect was for my family to treat these decorated war heroes like unwanted guests at their precious reunion, or for my sister to choose that moment to finally voice every resentment she'd been harboring since the day I enlisted. But here's what Cassandra didn't know about my squadron sisters. Technical Sergeant Blackstone had once stared down a Taliban commander who tried to intimidate her during prisoner negotiations. Staff Sergeant Thornfield had talked a suicidal airman off a ledge during her second tour. Senior Airman Maya Clearwater had pulled 3 civilians out of a bombed building in Kabul while under enemy fire. These weren't just my colleagues. They were women who had seen me at my absolute worst and my absolute best, who had watched me grow from a scared 20-year-old recruit into a captain they trusted with their lives. And when they saw someone, anyone, put their hands on me in anger, every protective instinct they'd developed in a decade of combat kicked in simultaneously. The reunion had been planned for months. Our extended families, scattered across Colorado, Wyoming, and Utah, would gather every 3 years at Millfield Gardens, this sprawling event center nestled in the foothills of the Rockies. Cousins would bring their new babies. Aunts would compare their latest diet successes. Uncles would argue about football teams and politics until someone's wife told them to knock it off. It should have been perfect. I'd been looking forward to it for months, especially because this was the first time I'd be attending as a captain, rather than a scared kid in basic training or a homesick airman calling from overseas. I'd earned my place at that table through 4 deployments, countless training exercises, and the kind of leadership that earned me a commendation from the Joint Chiefs of Staff. My squadron had planned to stay for just the weekend. Friday night barbecue, Saturday's main reunion event, Sunday brunch before flying back to Peterson Air Force Base. We'd booked rooms at the Mountain View Inn on Cascade Street, and I'd spent weeks briefing them on family dynamics, warning them about Uncle Robert's inappropriate jokes and Aunt Patricia's tendency to ask invasive questions about military pay. What I hadn't warned them about was Cassandra's jealousy, or how 28 years of sibling rivalry would explode into something that would change our family forever. Because when those 7 women stepped forward to surround my sister that day, it wasn't just about defending me from a physical confrontation. It was about showing my entire family exactly who they'd been dismissing all these years, and making it crystal clear that the little girl they remembered was now a woman with an army of her own. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. My name is Captain Jade Winters, and if you're watching this, I need you to understand something about loyalty. Have you ever had someone in your life who would literally fly across the country just to stand beside you when things got tough? Someone who would drop everything, leave their weekend plans, their families, their comfort zones, just because you asked them to meet the people who matter to you? That's what real loyalty looks like. Not the kind you're born into, not the kind that comes with shared DNA and childhood memories, but the kind you earn in the crucible of combat missions and trust exercises, where failure means someone doesn't come home. The kind where 7 women who've seen war, who've saved lives, who've earned their place among the most elite forces in our military, choose to spend their precious leave time at a family reunion in small-town Colorado because their captain, their sister-in-arms, wanted them there. But here's what I learned that day at Millfield Gardens. Sometimes the family you choose is the only family that will choose you back. Sometimes the people who share your blood are the very ones who'll try to make you bleed when you finally stand tall enough to cast a shadow. And sometimes, just sometimes, the moment your biological family shows their true colors is the exact moment your chosen family shows you what unconditional support really looks like. So buckle up, because this story isn't just about a sister who thought she could push around a decorated Air Force captain. This is about what happens when someone mistakes kindness for weakness, when they confuse military discipline for passive acceptance, and when they forget that the quiet kid who left for basic training 10 years ago came back as a woman who commands respect from warriors. Growing up in Millfield was like living in a snow globe. Beautiful from the outside, but impossibly small once you were trapped inside. Population 8,400, where everyone knew everyone's business, and the biggest excitement was the annual Harvest Festival every October. My childhood home sat on Elm Ridge Drive, a quiet street lined with blue spruce trees and houses that all looked like they'd been copied from the same 1980s suburban planning manual. White picket fences, 2-car garages, and the kind of manicured lawns that required weekly attention to maintain their picture-perfect appearance. In the Winters household, perfection wasn't just preferred, it was mandatory. My father, David Winters, managed the local branch of Rocky Mountain Credit Union and treated our family dinner table like a board meeting where everyone was expected to present their daily achievements for approval. My mother, Linda, taught 3rd grade at Millfield Elementary and had this way of smiling while delivering criticism that could cut deeper than any drill sergeant's yelling. And then there was Cassandra, 18 months older than me, who seemed to effortlessly excel at everything I struggled with. She was student body president, head cheerleader, prom queen, and had already been accepted to Colorado State University on a partial academic scholarship by the time I was a sophomore, struggling to maintain a C average in chemistry. I was the family afterthought, the one they described to neighbors as still finding her way while shooting those polite smiles that didn't quite reach their eyes. While Cassandra collected awards and college acceptance letters, I collected detentions for talking back to teachers and spent most afternoons hiding in my room reading military history books I'd checked out from the library. My fascination with aviation started when I was 12 and watched a documentary about the Tuskegee Airmen. Something about those pilots defying expectations, proving themselves against impossible odds, breaking barriers that others said couldn't be broken. It spoke to something deep inside me that I couldn't quite name at the time. By 16, I'd made my decision. I was going to join the Air Force the moment I turned 18. I'd researched every career field, memorized the requirements for officer candidate school, and even started running 5 miles every morning before school to build up my endurance. My family's reaction was underwhelming, to put it mildly. My father called it a waste of potential. My mother worried about what people would think, and Cassandra just rolled her eyes and said, "Trust Jade to choose the most dramatic way possible to get attention." They kept waiting for me to change my mind, kept suggesting community college, or maybe a nice secretarial program at the vocational school in nearby Riverside County. The night before I left for basic training at Lackland Air Force Base in Texas, we had what my family called a farewell dinner. Cassandra had just started her freshman year at Colorado State, studying business administration with plans to return to Millfield and eventually take over Dad's position at the credit union. The conversation that night revolved entirely around her classes, her sorority rush activities, and her new boyfriend who came from a good family in Denver. When dessert was served, my mother's famous apple pie that she only made for special occasions, my father cleared his throat and said, "Well, Jade, I suppose this is your big adventure. Try not to do anything that embarrasses the family name while you're gone." That was it. No pride, no encouragement, no acknowledgement that I was about to embark on one of the most challenging experiences a person could voluntarily undertake. My mother hugged me at the airport the next morning, but it was the kind of hug you give someone you're not sure you'll miss. Cassandra didn't even come to see me off. She had sorority obligations, she said. My father shook my hand like I was a business acquaintance and reminded me to call every Sunday. "So your mother doesn't worry." As I walked through the security checkpoint with my single duffel bag and a head full of dreams about flying, I felt this strange mixture of excitement and abandonment. I was finally free to become whoever I was meant to be, but I was doing it completely alone. Basic training was a shock to my system in ways I hadn't anticipated. Not the physical challenges. I'd prepared for those. Not even the mental pressure or the way drill instructors could break you down with words alone. What surprised me was how quickly I adapted to the structure, the camaraderie, the sense of purpose that came with being part of something bigger than myself. For the first time in my life, my accomplishments weren't measured against Cassandra's achievements or my parents' expectations. They were measured against my own potential, my own growth, my own commitment to excellence. I called home every Sunday like I'd promised, and the conversations followed the same predictable pattern. My mother would ask if I was eating enough and staying safe, my father would give me updates about the credit union's quarterly performance, and Cassandra would get on the line to tell me about her latest academic achievements or social successes. They'd ask perfunctory questions about my training. Is it very hard? Are the other girls nice? But I could tell they weren't really listening to the answers. When I tried to explain the thrill of my first solo flight or the pride I felt when I was selected for advanced leadership training, their responses were always variations of, "That's nice, dear," followed by a quick subject change to something happening back home. The real disconnect became obvious during my first leave, after completing basic training and technical school. I came home wearing my dress blues, feeling confident and proud of what I'd accomplished, only to discover that nothing in my childhood bedroom had changed. My twin bed still had the same pink comforter from high school, my desk still held the same romance novels I'd outgrown years ago, and my walls still displayed the participation ribbons from middle school track meets. It was like they'd preserved a museum to the person they wanted me to remain, rather than acknowledging the person I'd become. During that visit, the family dynamic felt suffocating in ways it never had before. Dinner conversations still revolved around Cassandra's college experiences and future plans, while my military service was treated like an extended summer camp that I'd eventually grow out of. When neighbors asked about me, my parents would say things like, "Oh, Jade is in the military right now, but we're hoping she'll come to her senses soon and maybe get her teaching certificate like her mother." They genuinely couldn't understand that this wasn't a phase or a rebellious gesture. This was my calling, my career, my life. 3. The phone call came on a Tuesday morning in March while I was reviewing flight schedules in my office at Peterson Air Force Base. I'd been promoted to captain just 6 months earlier, and my squadron was preparing for a deployment to Qatar that would put us in charge of tactical airlift operations across 3 countries. I was deep in logistics planning when my aide knocked on my door and said my mother was on line 2, calling from Millfield. That was unusual. My family had settled into a pattern of Sunday evening calls, and emergency contact was reserved for actual emergencies. "Jade, honey." My mother's voice sounded artificially bright, the way it did when she was delivering news she thought I might not want to hear. "I have something exciting to tell you. We're finally having the big family reunion this summer. You remember how we used to talk about getting everyone together? Well, Aunt Patricia and Uncle Robert have been planning it for months, and we've booked Millfield Gardens for the entire weekend of July 15th. I leaned back in my chair, watching through my office window as a formation of F-16s practiced maneuvers against the backdrop of the Colorado mountains. "That's great, Mom." It's been, 3 years since the last one? I was already calculating in my head whether I could get leave approved for that weekend, and whether I wanted to subject myself to 3 days of questions about when I was going to settle down and start acting like a normal person. "Actually, it's been 4 years," she corrected, and I could hear the slight reproach in her voice, as if my failure to keep track of family reunion intervals was evidence of my misplaced priorities. "Cassandra is so excited. She's bringing Derek. You remember Derek Morrison, don't you? They've been dating for 2 years now, and we think he might propose soon. He's a junior partner at Morrison, Klein and Associates in Denver, and his father owns half the real estate in Jefferson County." There it was. The inevitable comparison, delivered with the surgical precision my mother had perfected over the years. While I was commanding airmen and planning military operations, Cassandra was dating someone whose family owned property and whose career path would keep him safely within the acceptable radius of family expectations. I could picture the reunion already. Cassandra showing off her successful boyfriend while fielding congratulations about their future together, while I stood on the sidelines explaining my job to relatives who still thought the military was something you did when you couldn't figure out what to do with your life. "I'll put in for leave," I said, making a note on my calendar. "It'll be good to see everyone again." This was a lie, but it was the kind of lie that kept family peace, the kind I'd been telling for years to maintain the illusion that we were all still close despite the growing distance between their world and mine. "Oh, wonderful!" Mom's enthusiasm sounded genuine now. "And Jade, maybe this time you could, dress like a regular person? I know you're proud of your military service, but some of the relatives might feel more comfortable if you didn't emphasize it so much. Uncle Robert still gets funny about military things ever since Cousin Mark came back from Iraq with all those problems." I felt my jaw clench involuntarily. "You mean PTSD, Mom? Mark has PTSD, not problems, and I'll wear whatever I think is appropriate." The conversation was already heading in a direction I recognized. The gentle pressure to minimize my military identity, to blend in, to make everyone else more comfortable by making myself smaller. But something was different this time. Maybe it was the weight of the captain's bars on my uniform, or the confidence that came from leading a squadron of highly skilled airmen, or just the simple fact that I'd finally stopped apologizing for choosing a path they didn't understand. "Actually, Mom, I've been thinking about bringing some friends with me this time. My squadron sisters, You've heard me talk about them over the years. Technical Sergeant Blackstone, Staff Sergeant Thornfield, Senior Airman Clearwater, and a few others. They're incredible women, and I'd love for the family to finally meet them. The pause on the other end of the line stretched long enough that I thought we might have been disconnected. When my mother finally spoke, her voice had lost its artificial brightness. Friends? From the military? Jade, honey, this is a family reunion. It's not really appropriate to bring outsiders. People might feel uncomfortable having strangers around during such an intimate family gathering. They're not strangers to me, Mom. They're my family, too. The words came out sharper than I'd intended, but I didn't take them back. These women have been there for me through deployments, through combat training, through every major milestone of my adult life. If Derek Morrison gets to come because he might propose to Cassandra, then surely my closest friends, the people who've actually chosen to be part of my life, should be welcome too. Another long pause. I could practically hear my mother calculating how to handle this unexpected resistance, how to redirect me back toward the path of least conflict. Well, I suppose if they're really that important to you, but you'll need to check with Aunt Patricia. She's handling all the arrangements, and there might not be enough room at the venue for extra people. I almost laughed. Millfield Gardens was a sprawling event center that could easily accommodate twice our extended family size. The issue wasn't space. It was the fact that my mother couldn't picture my Squadron sisters fitting into their carefully curated image of what a family gathering should look like. I'll call Aunt Patricia myself, I said. Don't worry about it. But as soon as I hung up the phone, I realized this reunion was going to be more complicated than I'd initially thought. I'd spent years trying to bridge the gap between my military life and my family life, always adjusting myself to fit into their expectations, always downplaying my achievements to avoid making them uncomfortable. This time, I was going to do something different. This time, I was going to bring my whole authentic self to Millfield Gardens, Squadron sisters included, and let my family see exactly who Captain Jade Winters had become. The decision felt both liberating and terrifying. I'd been protecting my family from the reality of my military career for years, giving them sanitized versions of my experiences, avoiding stories that might make them proud but also might force them to acknowledge that their youngest daughter had become someone they didn't quite recognize. Now I was going to show up with 7 of the most accomplished women I knew, women who'd earned their respect through merit, courage, and dedication, and see how the Winters family handled meeting the people who actually knew me, supported me, and celebrated my successes without reservation. I spent the rest of that afternoon making phone calls to my Squadron sisters, explaining the reunion and extending invitations that I hoped they'd accept. Each conversation felt like a small act of rebellion against years of family pressure to compartmentalize my life, to keep my military identity separate from my civilian relationships. For the first time in years, I was excited about a family gathering, not because I expected it to go well, but because I finally had the courage to show up as myself, rather than as the person they wanted me to be. The pushback started almost immediately. 3 days after my conversation with Mom, Aunt Patricia called me directly, her voice carrying that particular blend of authority and condescension that I remembered from childhood family gatherings. Patricia had always been the family enforcer, the one who organized events and made sure everyone followed the unspoken rules about appropriate behavior and acceptable topics of conversation. "Jade, sweetheart," she began, and I could already tell this wasn't going to be a pleasant conversation. "Your mother mentioned that you want to bring some military friends to our little family gathering. Now, I know you mean well, but I think there's been a misunderstanding about what kind of event this is." I was sitting in my quarters at Peterson, reviewing personnel files for my upcoming Qatar deployment, but I set the papers aside and gave Patricia my full attention. "What kind of misunderstanding, Aunt Patricia?" "Well, dear, this is an intimate family reunion. We've planned very carefully for exactly the right number of people, and frankly, having strangers there would change the entire dynamic. These military people might not understand our family traditions, and some of the older relatives might feel uncomfortable around. Well, you know how some people can be about uniformed personnel. It might bring up unpleasant memories for some folks. There it was, the subtle suggestion that my squadron sisters would somehow be inappropriate or threatening to delicate family sensibilities. These aren't just military people, Aunt Patricia. These are decorated combat veterans, highly educated professional women, and my closest friends. Staff Sergeant Thornfield has a master's degree in aerospace engineering. Technical Sergeant Blackstone speaks 4 languages and has served as a diplomatic liaison in 3 different countries. They're hardly going to offend anyone with their presence. I'm sure they're very accomplished in their own way, Patricia said, her tone suggesting that military accomplishments didn't really count in her social calculus. But this reunion is about reconnecting with blood family, sharing our heritage, celebrating our shared history. Outsiders, no matter how well-intentioned, would just be, well, out of place. I felt my military training kick in, the ability to remain calm under pressure while strategically analyzing an opponent's weaknesses. So Derek Morrison isn't an outsider? Because last I checked, he's not related to us either, but apparently he's not only welcome but expected to be there. The pause told me I'd hit a nerve. Derek is practically family already. Everyone expects him to propose to Cassandra any day now. That's completely different from bringing a group of random military acquaintances. Random military acquaintances. I repeated the phrase slowly, tasting the dismissiveness of it. Aunt Patricia, these women have saved my life. Literally. They've been there for me through combat deployments, through family deaths you people didn't even know about because you never asked, through every significant moment of my adult life. If Derek qualifies as family because he might marry Cassandra, then surely the women who've actually been my family for the past decade deserve some consideration. Jade, you're being dramatic. It's just not practical. The venue is booked for a specific number of people, the catering is already arranged, and… How many people are you expecting? I interrupted. Well, approximately 65, but… Millfield Gardens accommodates up to 200 people. I checked their website after Mom mentioned the venue. So space isn't actually the issue, is it? Another pause, longer this time. When Patricia spoke again, her voice had shifted from diplomatic to defensive. The issue, young lady, is that this is a family event, not a military showcase. Some of us are concerned that you're trying to turn our reunion into some kind of statement. We've worked very hard to plan a nice, normal gathering where everyone can feel comfortable and relaxed. And there it was. The real objection. Not logistics, not space, not cost. The problem was that my squadron sisters represented everything my family had spent years trying to pretend didn't define me. They were living proof that I'd built a life, a career, a chosen family that existed completely outside their sphere of influence and approval. Having them at the reunion would force everyone to acknowledge that Captain Jade Winters wasn't the same person as little Jade, who'd left Millfield 10 years ago, hoping for their approval. A statement, I repeated. What kind of statement would that be exactly? You know what I mean, Jade, don't be difficult. But I genuinely didn't know what she meant, or rather, I wanted her to say it out loud, to articulate exactly what she found so threatening about the idea of meeting the women who'd shaped my adult life. No, Aunt Patricia, I really don't know what you mean. Please explain to me what statement I'd be making by introducing my family to my closest friends. The silence stretched so long I thought she might have hung up. When she finally spoke, her voice was tight with frustration. Fine. If you must know, some of us are concerned that you're trying to prove something. That you're bringing these people to show off, to make the rest of us feel small or unimportant. We're worried that you've changed in ways that might make family harmony difficult. Changed how? You've become very intense, very serious. You talk about leadership and responsibility and chain of command, like those things matter more than family loyalty. Some people feel like you look down on us now, like you think your military career makes you better than people who chose normal lives. I stood up from my desk and walked to the window, looking out at the flight line where jets were being prepared for training missions. So let me understand this correctly. You're worried that bringing my friends to meet my family will somehow prove that I think I'm better than all of you. But excluding them, refusing to let the family meet the people who matter most to me, that's supposed to demonstrate what, exactly? Family loyalty? It's supposed to demonstrate that you still remember where you came from and who raised you. I remember perfectly where I came from, Aunt Patricia. I also remember who supported me when I decided to leave, and who supported me since. Those aren't always the same people. The conversation deteriorated from there. Patricia became increasingly defensive about the family harmony I was supposedly threatening, while I became increasingly clear about my intention to bring my squadron sisters whether she approved or not. By the time we hung up, I knew the reunion was going to be a battlefield long before I ever set foot in Millfield Gardens. The next call came from Cassandra herself, 2 days later. She bypassed pleasantries entirely and went straight to what she clearly considered the heart of the matter. "Jade, what the hell are you doing? Aunt Patricia is furious. Mom is stressed out. And Dad is talking about uninviting you entirely if you keep pushing this military agenda." "Military agenda?" I almost laughed. "Cassandra, I invited some friends to meet my family. That's not an agenda, it's basic social interaction." "These aren't just friends, though, are they? They're your little military cult members. And you're bringing them to prove some point about how important and special you've become. Is that really what you think? That this is about proving something? Isn't it? Come on, Jade. You've spent years acting like you're too good for Millfield, too evolved for family traditions, too accomplished for our simple little lives. Now you want to parade your warrior women around, like some kind of validation that you made the right choice abandoning us for the military." The accusation hit harder than I'd expected, partly because there was a grain of truth in it that I didn't want to examine too closely. But mostly it stung because it revealed how completely my family had misunderstood everything about my military service, my relationships, and my motivations. They saw my squadron sisters as props in some imagined power play, rather than as the authentic relationships they actually were. That night after Cassandra's call, I sat in my quarters staring at the photos on my desk. There was one from my commissioning ceremony, me in dress blues, beaming with pride while my parents stood awkwardly beside me, looking like they'd rather be anywhere else. Another from my first deployment to Afghanistan, where I was laughing with my squadron after successfully completing a particularly dangerous supply run. A third from last year's promotion ceremony, where Technical Sergeant Blackstone had pinned my captain's bars while the rest of my squadron cheered in the background. Looking at those photos, I realized something that should have been obvious years ago. I'd been living 2 completely separate lives, and I was exhausted from the effort it took to keep them apart. In one life, I was Captain Jade Winters, confident, respected, a leader who made decisions that affected dozens of people and operations that spanned multiple countries. In the other life, I was still that uncertain teenager who'd left Millfield, hoping desperately that someday her family might be proud of her accomplishments. But here's what that phone call with Cassandra had made crystal clear. They were never going to be proud. Not because my accomplishments weren't worthy of pride, but because acknowledging my success would force them to confront their own assumptions about what constituted a valuable life. My military career wasn't just different from their expectations. It was a direct challenge to everything they believed about proper choices, appropriate ambitions, and acceptable ways to contribute to society. I picked up my phone and scrolled through my contacts until I found Technical Sergeant Riley Blackstone's number. Riley had been my mentor since my first day at Peterson, a 20-year veteran who'd seen combat in 3 different theaters and had more leadership experience than most colonels I knew. If anyone could help me think through this situation strategically, it was her. "Captain," Riley answered on the second ring, her voice instantly alert despite the late hour. Everything okay?" "I need some advice," I said, and then found myself explaining the entire situation. The family reunion, the resistance to my squadron sisters attending, the accusations about military agendas and abandoning family loyalty. Riley listened without interruption, the way she always did when someone brought her a complex problem that required careful analysis. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment. "Captain, can I ask you something? Why do you want us there?" The question caught me off guard. "What do you mean?" "I mean, what's your actual objective here? Are you trying to prove something to your family, or are you trying to share something with them? Because those are two very different missions, and they require completely different strategies." I thought about that while watching the lights of Colorado Springs twinkling in the distance. I guess I want them to understand who I've become, not just my rank or my job, but the person I am now. And you all are such a huge part of that. You've shaped me in ways they never could, supported me through things they never even knew about. I want them to meet the women who actually know me. And what if they refuse to see it? What if they meet us and still choose to believe that your military service is just a phase you'll eventually outgrow? Then at least I'll know I tried. At least I'll know I showed up authentically, instead of continuing to pretend I'm still the person they want me to be. Riley's voice softened slightly. "You know, I've been to family events with squadron members before. Sometimes it goes well, sometimes it doesn't. But the ones who regret it are usually the ones who went in trying to prove something, instead of just sharing something. Your family might not understand us, Captain, but that doesn't mean we can't show them respect while still being ourselves." That conversation shifted something fundamental in my thinking. This wasn't about winning an argument with my family or proving that I'd made the right choices. This was about finally integrating the two parts of my life instead of keeping them carefully separated. For 10 years, I'd been protecting my family from the reality of who I'd become, and protecting my squadron sisters from the dysfunction of where I'd come from. Maybe it was time to stop protecting everyone and just let them meet each other honestly. The next morning, I made a decision that felt both terrifying and liberating. I was going to the reunion, and I was bringing my squadron sisters, regardless of what my family thought about it. But I wasn't going to argue with them anymore, wasn't going to try to convince them that this was appropriate or necessary. I was simply going to do it, and let the consequences unfold naturally. I called my mother first, before I could lose my nerve. "Mom, I wanted to let you know that I'll be at the reunion on July 15th, and I'll be bringing Technical Sergeant Blackstone, Staff Sergeant Thornfield, Senior Airman Clearwater, and Sergeant Martinez with me. We'll handle our own accommodations at the Mountain View Inn, so you don't need to worry about logistics." "Jade, honey, I really wish you'd reconsider." "Mom," I interrupted gently, "this isn't a negotiation. These women are my family too, and I'm not willing to keep pretending they don't exist, just to make everyone else more comfortable. If that creates problems for the reunion, then we'll deal with those problems when they arise." The silence on the other end lasted so long I thought she'd hung up. When she finally spoke, her voice was small and hurt. "I don't understand why you're doing this to us. We've tried so hard to support your military career, and now you're using it like a weapon against your own family." "I'm not using anything as a weapon, Mom. I'm just tired of compartmentalizing my life. I'm tired of pretending that the most important relationships I've built as an adult somehow don't count because they happened in uniform. These women have been there for me, through deployments, through combat situations, through personal crises that you never even knew about because I was trying to protect you from worrying. They deserve to be acknowledged, not hidden away like some embarrassing secret." "What personal crises?" My mother's voice sharpened with what might have been genuine concern. "What haven't you told us?" And there it was, the opening that revealed everything wrong with our relationship. She was worried about crises she didn't know about, but she'd never been curious enough to ask about my actual experiences. Never shown interest in the details of my deployments or the challenges of military leadership. She wanted to be protected from the difficult parts of my life, but still expected to be considered central to my emotional landscape. "Mom, 3 years ago, I was in a helicopter crash in Afghanistan. We lost 2 crew members, and I spent 4 days in a field hospital with a concussion and internal bleeding. Technical Sergeant Blackstone flew out from her own deployment in Iraq to sit by my bedside until I was stable enough for transport. I never told you about it because I knew it would upset you, and because by the time I was recovered enough to call, the crisis was over. But she was there. She's been there for every major moment of my adult life, good and bad. If you can't understand why that matters to me, then maybe that's the real problem we need to address. The phone went quiet again. When my mother spoke, her voice was barely a whisper. You were in a helicopter crash? You could have died, and we never knew? I could have died in a dozen different situations over the past 10 years, Mom. That's what military service means. But I've survived, and I've thrived because I've had people watching my back who understand the risks and choose to be there anyway. Those are the people I'm bringing to meet you, whether you're ready for that or not. After I hung up, I felt simultaneously guilty and relieved. Guilty for finally telling my mother something that would worry her, but relieved to stop carrying the burden of protecting everyone from the reality of my choices. For the first time in years, I was going to show up to a family event as my complete, authentic self, and whatever happened would happen. July 15th arrived with the kind of perfect Colorado weather that makes you understand why people write poetry about mountain summers. Clear blue skies, temperature in the mid-70s, and just enough breeze to keep the heat comfortable. I stood in the lobby of the Mountain View Inn at 0800 hours, wearing my dress blues and watching my Squadron sisters check in at the front desk. Technical Sergeant Riley Blackstone looked immaculate in her uniform, every ribbon perfectly aligned, her bearing radiating the kind of quiet authority that came from 2 decades of military service. Staff Sergeant Amber Thornfield was double-checking the GPS directions to Millfield Gardens on her phone, while Sergeant Rosa Martinez adjusted her insignia with the precision of someone who understood that presentation mattered in situations like this. Senior Airman Maya Clearwater emerged from the elevator carrying a small gift bag, and I felt a surge of affection watching her navigate this civilian social situation with the same careful attention she brought to complex tactical operations. These women had faced down enemy fire, survived emergency landings in hostile territory, and commanded respect in some of the most challenging environments on Earth. Now they were preparing to meet my family at a reunion that might prove more diplomatically complex than anything they'd encountered overseas. All right, ladies, I said as they gathered in the lobby. Before we head over, I want to make sure everyone understands the terrain we're walking into. This isn't a hostile environment, but it's definitely unfamiliar territory for all of us. Riley nodded, her expression serious, but not tense. What's our mission objective, Captain? Integration, I said simply. I want them to meet you, and I want you to meet them. No agenda beyond that. If they're welcoming, great. If they're not, we maintain our dignity and extract gracefully. But either way, I'm done pretending that the most important people in my adult life don't exist. Amber looked up from her phone. How do you want us to handle the inevitable questions about deployment experiences? Some civilians get uncomfortable with details, others get inappropriately curious about combat situations. Standard protocol, I replied, professional but not detailed. We serve our country, we're proud of our service, and we leave it at that unless someone asks specific, respectful questions. Maya, I know your family background helps you navigate civilian social dynamics. If you see any of us getting cornered by someone who's pushing inappropriate boundaries, feel free to redirect. Maya smiled, her expression confident. Roger that, Captain. My grandmother would be horrified if I let anyone make a scene at a family gathering, even if it's not my family. As we walked the 3 blocks from the Mountain View Inn to Millfield Gardens, I found myself seeing my hometown through their eyes. The tree-lined streets with their carefully maintained Victorian houses, the small downtown area with its antique shops and coffee houses, the mountain views that provided a stunning backdrop to everyday life. It was undeniably beautiful, and I felt a surge of pride showing them where I'd grown up, even as I braced myself for what was about to unfold. Millfield Gardens sat on 5 acres at the edge of town, a sprawling venue with indoor and outdoor event spaces surrounded by meticulously landscaped grounds. The parking lot was already full when we arrived, and I could see familiar faces through the windows of the main pavilion. My stomach tightened with a mixture of anticipation and dread as we approached the entrance. The first person to spot us was my cousin Mark, Uncle Robert's son, who'd served 2 tours in Iraq before coming home with PTSD that the family still couldn't quite figure out how to handle. He was standing near the registration table when we walked in, and his face lit up with genuine recognition and respect when he saw our uniforms. "Holy shit," he said, then immediately looked embarrassed. "Sorry, excuse my language, but are you Captain Winter's Squadron sisters? She's talked about you guys in every conversation we've had for the past 5 years." Riley stepped forward and extended her hand. "Technical Sergeant Riley Blackstone. You must be Mark. The captain's mentioned you as well. 2nd Infantry Division, right? Thank you for your service." I watched Mark's posture straighten as he shook hands with each of my squadron sisters, saw the way his eyes brightened with something that might have been relief. Here were people who understood military culture, who didn't treat his service like a tragic phase he needed to recover from. Within minutes, they were deep in conversation about deployment experiences and transition challenges, and I realized this was the first time I'd ever seen Mark completely comfortable at a family gathering. But the warm reception from Mark was immediately offset by the reactions from other family members. I saw Aunt Patricia across the room, her face tightening when she spotted our group. Uncle David, who'd been holding court near the bar, stopped mid-sentence and stared at us with an expression I couldn't quite read. And then I saw my parents, standing with Cassandra and Derek near the buffet table, all 4 of them frozen in what looked like shock. "Captain," Rosa murmured quietly, "I think we just became the center of attention." She was right. Conversations had stopped, heads were turning, and I could feel the weight of 65 pairs of eyes assessing our little group. Some faces showed curiosity, others showed discomfort, and a few showed what might have been disapproval. But what struck me most was the silence. The kind of awkward quiet that settles over a room when something unexpected has disrupted the planned social dynamics. My mother recovered first, walking toward us with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Jade, sweetheart," she said, reaching up to hug me carefully as if my uniform might somehow be contaminated. "You look very official." "Mom, I'd like you to meet my squadron sisters." I gestured to each woman as I made introductions. Technical Sergeant Riley Blackstone, Staff Sergeant Amber Thornfield, Senior Airman Maya Clearwater, and Sergeant Rosa Martinez. "Ladies, this is my mother, Linda Winters." I watched my mother's face as she shook hands with each of my squadron sisters, saw her trying to reconcile these poised, articulate, professional women with whatever image she'd constructed in her mind of military people. Riley's firm handshake and direct eye contact, Amber's warm smile and easy conversational style, Maya's natural grace and genuine interest in meeting family members, Rosa's respectful demeanor and perfect posture. None of it matched the stereotype my mother had been carrying. "It's lovely to meet you," my mother said, and I could tell she meant it, even as she struggled with something she couldn't quite articulate. "Jade has mentioned you all so many times over the years." But before anyone could respond to that diplomatic opening, Cassandra appeared at my mother's shoulder, Derek trailing behind her like an expensive accessory. My sister looked stunning, as always. Perfectly styled hair, designer dress that probably cost more than a month of military pay, engagement ring that Derek had apparently finally produced, judging by the way she kept positioning her left hand for maximum visibility. "So," Cassandra said, her voice carrying across the immediate area with the kind of projection that suggested she wanted everyone nearby to hear this conversation, "these are the famous military friends we've heard so much about. How interesting that you all decided to come in uniform. Most people dress down for family events, but I suppose when your whole identity revolves around your job, It's hard to find civilian clothes that feel authentic." The insult was delivered with a smile, but it was unmistakably an insult, designed to put my squadron sisters in their place while establishing Cassandra's social superiority. I felt my jaw clench and started to respond, but Riley placed a gentle hand on my arm, a subtle signal that she had this handled. "Actually," Riley said, her voice perfectly calm and friendly, "we chose to wear our dress uniforms as a sign of respect for your family gathering. In military culture, dress uniform is equivalent to formal civilian attire. It's what we wear when we want to honor an important occasion. We certainly didn't want to appear underdressed for such a significant family celebration." The response was masterful. It reframed the uniform choice as a gesture of respect rather than a display of professional identity, while gently educating Cassandra about military customs without making her look foolish. But I could see from my sister's expression that she wasn't interested in education or cultural understanding. She was looking for a fight, and she wasn't going to be deterred by diplomatic responses. Derek Morrison stepped forward then, positioning himself slightly in front of Cassandra in what I recognized as a protective gesture, though whether he was protecting her or the situation from escalating further wasn't clear. He extended his hand toward Riley with the kind of confident smile that suggested he was accustomed to smoothing over social tensions through sheer force of charm and privilege. "Derek Morrison," he said, his voice carrying the polished cadence of someone who'd spent years in law school learning to command a room. "I've heard so much about Jade's military career. Cassandra tells me you've all served together overseas. That must have been quite an adventure." Adventure. The word hung in the air like a poorly thrown grenade, and I saw Maya's eyes narrow, almost imperceptibly. Amber's smile became a fraction more fixed, and I could feel Rosa's posture shift beside me into what we called professional patience mode, the stance we adopted when dealing with civilians who meant well but had no understanding of what they were actually talking about. Riley, however, maintained her diplomatic composure. "We've had the privilege of serving our country in various capacities, yes. The captain here has been an exceptional leader in some very challenging environments." But Cassandra wasn't finished. I could see something building in her expression, a kind of focused intensity that I remembered from childhood arguments that were about to escalate beyond the point of easy resolution. She'd gotten that same look before she'd told our parents that I'd been the one who broke Mom's antique vase, or when she'd convinced them that I was lying about completing my homework. It was the expression of someone who'd identified a weakness and was preparing to exploit it. "Challenging environments," she repeated, as if tasting the phrase. "Is that military speak for getting shot at? Because honestly, I've never understood why anyone would voluntarily put themselves in situations where people are trying to kill them." "It seems so." She paused, clearly searching for the word that would inflict maximum damage. "Unnecessary. I mean, there are so many ways to serve your community without running off to foreign countries to play war games." The silence that followed was deafening. I felt heat rising in my cheeks and had to consciously control my breathing to avoid responding with the kind of sharp retort that would escalate this from a social disagreement to a family crisis. But before I could formulate any response, Maya stepped forward, her voice carrying the kind of quiet authority that came from years of dealing with hostile populations in diplomatic situations. "You raise an interesting point about community service," she said, her tone remaining conversational despite the obvious provocation. "I imagine your work here in Millfield contributes significantly to the local community. What field are you in?" It was a brilliant deflection, acknowledging Cassandra's comment without validating it, while redirecting the conversation towards safer ground. But Cassandra seemed to realize she was being managed, and that realization only intensified whatever anger she was carrying. "I work in marketing for a nonprofit that supports local businesses," she said, her voice taking on a defensive edge. "We focus on sustainable economic development that actually helps real people in real communities, instead of," she gestured vaguely in our direction, "whatever it is you all do over there." "Whatever it is we do," Amber repeated slowly, and I could hear decades of professional composure being tested. "Would you like me to explain what we do, or would you prefer to continue making assumptions?" The question was delivered with perfect politeness, but there was steel underneath it, the kind of controlled strength that came from women who'd learned to command respect in male-dominated environments while never losing their professional bearing. I saw Uncle Robert and Aunt Patricia moving closer, apparently sensing that this conversation was heading toward territory that might require damage control. But my father reached us first, appearing at my mother's shoulder with an expression that mixed embarrassment, frustration, and something that might have been paternal protectiveness, though I wasn't sure whether he was trying to protect me or protect the reunion from me. "Ladies," he said, his voice carrying the kind of forced joviality that people use when they're trying to prevent an argument they can see coming. "Perhaps we could continue this conversation over lunch? Patricia has arranged a wonderful buffet, and I'm sure everyone would benefit from some food and a change of scenery." It was a reasonable suggestion, and under normal circumstances, it might have worked. But these weren't normal circumstances, and Cassandra wasn't finished making her point. She turned to face our father directly, her voice rising slightly in volume and intensity. "Dad, don't you think it's interesting that Jade couldn't just come home and have a normal family reunion like everyone else? She had to turn it into some kind of military demonstration. Look around." She gestured toward the other family members who were clearly watching our interaction with fascination and discomfort. "Everyone's staring at us because she brought her little army to intimidate us into treating her like some kind of war hero." That's when something inside me finally snapped. Not the hot, explosive anger that leads to shouting matches and dramatic exits, but the cold, focused fury that comes from years of accumulated hurt, finally crystallizing into perfect clarity. I stepped forward, moving slightly ahead of my squadron sisters, and looked my sister directly in the eye. "Cassandra," I said, my voice carrying the kind of quiet command authority that could cut through battlefield chaos, "I need you to be very careful about what you say next." The warning was clear, and everyone within earshot understood that we'd reached a moment where the conversation could either de-escalate or explode completely. I saw my mother's face go pale, watched my father's jaw tighten with what I recognized as his own rising anger, and noticed that Derek had taken a small step backward, apparently realizing that his girlfriend had pushed this situation beyond his ability to manage with charm and legal training. But Cassandra, perhaps emboldened by what she perceived as family support, or perhaps simply too committed to her attack to retreat gracefully, chose escalation over wisdom. "Or what?" she demanded, her voice now carrying clearly across the pavilion and drawing the attention of relatives who'd been trying to pretend they weren't listening. "You'll have your military friends intimidate me? You'll pull rank on your own sister at a family gathering? Face it, Jade, you brought them here to make us all feel small, to prove that you're more important than the people who actually love you and have been here your whole life." The accusation hung in the air like smoke from an explosion, impossible to ignore and loaded with implications that went far beyond sibling rivalry. I felt my squadron sisters shifting positions behind me, not aggressively, but with the subtle adjustments that indicated they were prepared for whatever might happen next. Riley moved slightly to my right, Amber to my left, while Maya and Rosa maintained their positions but adjusted their stance in ways that created a loose formation around me. It wasn't threatening. To a civilian observer, it might have looked like nothing more than friends gathering closer during a tense moment. But to anyone with military training, the movement was unmistakable. These women were preparing to protect their captain, and they were doing it with the kind of coordinated precision that only came from years of working together in high-stakes situations. That's when I realized that the discovery wasn't just that having my squadron sisters at the reunion had changed the family dynamics. It was that my family's reaction to them was revealing truths about our relationships that had been hidden for years. Cassandra's hostility, my parents' discomfort, the extended family's fascination and unease, all of it was stripping away the polite fiction that we were a close, supportive family unit and exposing the reality that I had been tolerated rather than celebrated, accommodated rather than embraced. But the most important discovery was this. I was no longer the isolated, approval-seeking daughter who had left Millfield 10 years ago. I was a captain in the United States Air Force, surrounded by women who respected my leadership and would stand with me regardless of what my biological family chose to believe about my worth. The moment stretched between us like a live wire, charged with 10 years of accumulated resentment and misunderstanding. I could feel the eyes of our entire extended family, focused on this confrontation, could sense conversations stopping at tables throughout the pavilion, as relatives realized they were witnessing something that would be talked about for years to come. But more than that, I could feel my squadron sisters behind me, their presence solid and unwavering, and for the first time in my life at a family gathering, I felt like I had backup. I took a breath, centering myself the way I'd learned to do before making critical decisions under pressure, and then I made a choice that would have been impossible for the uncertain young woman who'd left Millfield a decade ago. I was going to stop managing everyone else's comfort and start speaking my truth. "You want to know why I brought them here, Cassandra?" I said, my voice carrying clearly across the pavilion. "I brought them here because these 4 women have been my family for the past 10 years. They've celebrated my promotions when none of you called. They've held me together after combat missions when none of you even knew I was deployed. They've supported my dreams, respected my choices, and never once made me feel like I needed to apologize for who I've become." I gestured toward Riley, whose 20 years of service had taken her through some of the most dangerous assignments the Air Force had to offer. Technical Sergeant Blackstone has a Bronze Star with Valor and 2 Air Medals. She's saved more lives than most doctors, led more successful missions than most colonels, and showed me what real leadership looks like when I was a scared second lieutenant who didn't know if she belonged in the military. Then I turned toward Amber, whose expertise in aerospace engineering had revolutionized several tactical systems currently in use across 3 different aircraft platforms. Staff Sergeant Thornfield has 2 master's degrees and holds 3 patents on navigation systems that have prevented countless aircraft accidents. She's briefed Pentagon officials on technology improvements and has been featured in Scientific American for her innovations in flight safety. Maya stepped forward slightly as I continued, her bearing reflecting the diplomatic training that had made her invaluable in international crisis situations. Senior Airman Clearwater speaks 5 languages fluently and has served as a cultural liaison in situations where miscommunication could have led to international incidents. She's helped negotiate the safe release of hostages and has been personally commended by the Secretary of State for her work in conflict resolution. Finally, I looked toward Rosa, whose medical expertise had saved lives in field conditions that would have challenged fully equipped hospitals. Sergeant Martinez is a combat medic who's performed emergency surgery in the back of moving vehicles under enemy fire. She's kept wounded soldiers alive through helicopter evacuations and has been awarded the Combat Medical Badge for her courage under fire. The silence that followed was different from before. Not the awkward quiet of social discomfort, but the stunned silence of people processing information that completely reframed their understanding of a situation. I watched my family's faces as they absorbed what I'd just told them, saw the moment when several relatives began to understand that these weren't just military friends I'd brought to show off, but accomplished professionals whose achievements far exceeded most civilian standards. But I wasn't finished. 10 years of swallowing family criticism, of minimizing my accomplishments to avoid making anyone uncomfortable, of pretending that my military service was somehow less valuable than traditional civilian careers. All of that ended right here, right now. These women have earned my respect, my loyalty, and my love through their actions, their character, and their unwavering support of each other and of me. They didn't inherit their place in my life through accidents of birth or shared DNA. They earned it. And yes, Cassandra, I brought them here because I wanted you all to meet the people who actually know me, who've seen me at my best and my worst, who've supported my growth instead of trying to keep me small. I could see Cassandra's face flushing with anger and embarrassment, could see Derek looking increasingly uncomfortable as he realized this confrontation was spiraling beyond anything his privileged background had prepared him to handle. My parents stood frozen, probably trying to calculate how to contain damage they couldn't fully comprehend. But then something happened that I hadn't expected. Cousin Mark, who'd been standing quietly near the registration table during this entire exchange, began walking toward us. Not the hesitant, careful approach of someone trying to diffuse tension, but the confident stride of a fellow veteran who recognized what was happening and had decided which side he was on. "Captain Winters is right," he said, his voice carrying the kind of authority that comes from combat experience and hard-earned wisdom. "I've been watching this conversation, and I need to say something before it goes any further." He stopped directly beside me, close enough that anyone observing would understand he was positioning himself in solidarity with me and my squadron sisters. "I served 2 tours in Iraq with the 2nd Infantry Division, and I've spent the past 8 years struggling with PTSD that this family has never understood how to handle. You all treat my service like a tragedy I need to recover from, like something shameful that's better left undiscussed." Mark's voice grew stronger as he continued, and I could see relatives throughout the pavilion turning to listen to what might be the most honest thing anyone had said at a Winters family gathering in years. But in the 15 minutes I've spent talking with these women, I've felt more understood and respected than I have at every family event since I came home from Baghdad. They get it. They understand what service means, what sacrifice looks like, what it costs to put your life on the line for people who will never know your name. He turned to face Cassandra directly, and I could see years of accumulated frustration finally finding its voice. "You want to talk about unnecessary risks and playing war games? I'll tell you what's unnecessary. The way this family treats anyone who chooses to serve something bigger than themselves. The way you make Jade feel like she has to apologize for being extraordinary. The way you act like her accomplishments don't count because they happened in uniform, instead of in some corporate boardroom." The impact of Mark's words was immediate and visible. I saw Aunt Patricia's face go pale as she realized her own son was publicly contradicting the family's unofficial policy of treating military service as a phase rather than a calling. Uncle Robert looked like he'd been slapped, probably because he'd spent years trying to help Mark move past his military experience rather than processing and honoring it. But the most dramatic change was in the faces of my extended family. Aunts, uncles, and cousins, who'd been watching this confrontation with curiosity and growing discomfort, were now looking at my squadron sisters with something approaching awe. The introductions I'd given, combined with Mark's passionate defense, had completely recontextualized who these women were and what their presence at the reunion meant. Technical Sergeant Blackstone stepped forward then, her voice calm and professional but carrying an undertone of steel that suggested she'd made her own decision about how this situation needed to be handled. "Ma'am," she said, addressing Cassandra with the kind of respectful formality that somehow managed to be more cutting than any insult could have been, "I appreciate your concern about your sister's choices, but I think you may have misunderstood something fundamental about why we're here." Riley's posture was perfectly erect, her hands clasped behind her back in parade rest, her expression neutral but alert. "We didn't come to this reunion to intimidate anyone or to make anyone feel small. We came because Captain Winters invited us to meet the family she's talked about for years, the people who raised her, who shaped her early character, who gave her the foundation that allowed her to become the exceptional officer and leader she is today." The words were delivered with such perfect sincerity that it took a moment for the full impact to register. Riley was giving my family credit for my success, while simultaneously making it clear that they were squandering the opportunity to celebrate what their daughter had accomplished. It was a masterpiece of diplomatic communication, acknowledging their importance while pointing out their failure to recognize mine. "But if our presence makes you uncomfortable," Riley continued, "if having us here somehow diminishes your family celebration, then perhaps we've learned something important about the kind of support system the captain has been working with all these years." The diplomatic precision of Riley's words hung in the air for perhaps 3 seconds before Cassandra's composure finally shattered completely. I watched my sister's face cycle through shock, rage, and something that looked like panic as she realized that her carefully constructed attack had not only failed, but had been turned against her with surgical efficiency. The extended family members who had been watching with growing fascination were now looking at her with expressions ranging from embarrassment to outright disapproval. "Don't you dare," Cassandra said, her voice rising to a volume that carried across the entire pavilion. "Don't you dare come into our family gathering and lecture us about supporting Jade. We've supported her for 28 years. Through every phase, every mistake, every time she needed to come home and figure out what she was doing with her life." She took a step toward Riley, her finger pointing accusingly, and I felt every muscle in my body tense as I recognized the aggressive body language that had preceded every major childhood confrontation we'd ever had. "You people don't know anything about our family dynamics, about our history, about what we've been through together. You show up here in your costumes and your medals and think you can judge us?" That's when Maya moved. Not dramatically, not threateningly, but with the fluid precision of someone who'd spent years in situations where positioning could mean the difference between successful negotiation and dangerous escalation. She stepped slightly forward and to the left, creating a subtle barrier between Cassandra and Riley, while maintaining what looked like casual conversational spacing. "Ma'am," Maya said, her voice carrying the kind of calm authority that had helped her diffuse international incidents, "I think there may be some miscommunication here. We're not judging anyone. We're simply grateful to finally meet the family that raised someone we admire and respect so deeply." But Cassandra was beyond diplomatic intervention now. 28 years of sibling rivalry, combined with whatever insecurities my military success had triggered in her, had reached a boiling point that no amount of careful language could contain. "Admire and respect," she laughed, but there was no humor in it. "You admire someone who runs away from her family every chance she gets? Who chooses strangers over the people who actually love her? Who comes home wearing a uniform like it's some kind of armor against having to be a normal person?" She turned to face me directly, her eyes bright with tears of frustration and rage. "You want to know the truth about your precious Captain Winters? She's been running away from responsibility her entire life. Instead of staying home and contributing to her community like a normal person, she joined the military so she could play dress-up and boss people around, and never have to deal with real adult relationships." The accusations came rapid-fire now, as if years of suppressed resentment were finally finding their voice. "She's never had a serious relationship because she's too selfish to put anyone else first. She's never bought a house or started a family or done any of the things that actually matter in life. All she's done is run around the world playing soldier while the rest of us stayed here and built actual lives with actual meaning." I felt something cold settle in my chest. Not anger, but a kind of crystalline clarity that comes when someone finally says the things you've always suspected they believed but never had the courage to voice. This wasn't just about the reunion or my Squadron sisters. This was about fundamental differences in how we defined success, contribution, and worth. But before I could respond, something happened that I absolutely hadn't expected. Amber stepped forward, her expression serious but not hostile, and addressed Cassandra with the kind of patient professionalism she usually reserved for briefing senior officers on complex technical matters. "I'm sorry, but I have to disagree with your assessment," Amber said, her voice carrying clearly across the now silent pavilion. "In the 5 years I've served under Captain Winters' leadership, I've watched her make decisions that directly saved lives. Not metaphorically, not in some abstract way. Literally saved the lives of aircrew members, ground personnel, and civilian contractors who are alive today because of her judgment under pressure." She gestured toward Rosa, who nodded, and stepped forward to join the conversation. "During our last deployment to Afghanistan, Captain Winters personally coordinated a medical evacuation under enemy fire that extracted 4 wounded soldiers from a compromised position. She stayed on the ground directing the operation until every person was safely aboard the aircraft, despite taking small arms fire and knowing that staying increased her own risk exponentially." Maya added her voice to the growing testimony. "The diplomatic work she's done in conflict zones has helped establish communication protocols that are still being used today. Her cultural sensitivity and language skills have prevented misunderstandings that could have escalated into international incidents. I watched Cassandra's face as my squadron sisters described operations she'd never heard about, achievements that had never been mentioned in our careful Sunday phone calls, because I'd learned years ago that my family preferred sanitized versions of my military service. They wanted to know I was safe and successful, but they didn't want details that might force them to grapple with the reality of what I actually did for a living. But it wasn't just the operational achievements that my squadron sisters were describing. Riley spoke up again, her voice carrying the weight of 2 decades of military leadership experience. Beyond her professional accomplishments, Captain Winters is the kind of leader that people trust with their lives because she's proven over and over again that she values every person under her command, above her own comfort or advancement. She's turned down promotion opportunities that would have advanced her career, but required her to leave her squadron during critical deployment periods. The testimonials continued, each one adding another layer to a picture of military service and leadership that was completely at odds with Cassandra's characterization of my choices. I realized that my squadron sisters were doing more than defending me. They were educating my entire extended family about what military leadership actually meant, what kinds of decisions I made on a daily basis, and what the stakes were for the people who depended on my judgment. But the most powerful moment came when Rosa, who rarely spoke at length in social situations, stepped forward with an expression of quiet intensity that immediately commanded attention. "Ma'am," she said, addressing Cassandra directly, "I need you to understand something about the woman you just described as selfish and irresponsible. 2 years ago, I was going through a divorce that was destroying me emotionally and affecting my performance. I was making mistakes that could have gotten people hurt, and I was too proud to ask for help." Rosa's voice remained steady, but I could see the emotional weight of what she was sharing. Captain Winters noticed the changes in my behavior before my own family did. She arranged for me to get counseling, personally covered my duties when I needed time off, and spent hours talking me through the worst period of my life. She didn't have to do any of that. It would have been easier and more professional to simply document my performance issues and let the system handle it. She paused, looking around at the faces of my extended family, making sure they were really listening. But that's not who she is. She saw a person who was struggling, and she chose to help, even though it meant extra work and personal risk for her if my performance didn't improve. That's the kind of leader she is, and that's the kind of person she's always been. The silence that followed Rosa's testimony was profound. I could see family members throughout the pavilion processing information that completely contradicted whatever assumptions they'd made about my military service and my character. More importantly, I could see Cassandra realizing that her attack had not only failed but had exposed her own ignorance about the sister she claimed to know so well. But instead of backing down or acknowledging that she might have been wrong, Cassandra did something that crystallized everything toxic about our family dynamics. She looked directly at me, her expression twisting with a kind of desperate malice, and delivered the attack she thought would end this confrontation in her favor. "All of this is very touching," she said, her voice dripping with sarcasm, "but it doesn't change the fact that you've always thought you were better than us. You've always acted like Millfield wasn't good enough for you, like our family wasn't sophisticated enough, like our values weren't important enough for someone as special as you." She gestured around the pavilion, taking in the relatives who were watching this confrontation with growing discomfort. "Look around, Jade. Look at all the people who've been there for you your whole life, who've supported you and loved you unconditionally, and tell me that these strangers matter more than we do." And then, as if the words themselves weren't enough, as if she needed to punctuate her emotional assault with something more visceral, Cassandra took 2 quick steps forward and shoved me hard in the chest with both hands. The push wasn't intended to hurt me. My military training meant I absorbed the impact easily and maintained my balance without difficulty. But the gesture was so unexpected, so completely inappropriate for the setting, and so obviously intended to provoke a reaction, that it stunned everyone in the immediate vicinity into momentary silence. That silence lasted exactly long enough for my squadron sisters to process what had just happened and respond accordingly. What happened next unfolded with the kind of coordinated precision that can only come from years of working together in high-stakes situations where split-second timing can mean the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure. Riley moved first, stepping forward with the fluid precision of someone who'd spent 20 years training for situations where decisive action could prevent escalation into something far worse. But she wasn't moving aggressively. Instead, she positioned herself directly between Cassandra and me, her posture erect and professional, her expression calm but absolutely unwavering. Amber appeared at Riley's left shoulder with the same coordinated timing they'd perfected during countless tactical exercises, while Maya materialized on the right. Rosa completed the formation by taking position slightly behind and to my right, creating a protective semicircle that surrounded Cassandra without trapping her, contained the situation without escalating it, and made one thing absolutely crystal clear to every person in that pavilion: no one was going to lay hands on their captain again. The formation was beautiful in its precision and terrifying in its implications. These weren't four random women reacting emotionally to seeing their friend pushed. These were combat-tested veterans, moving with the kind of coordinated discipline that most people only see in military documentaries or action movies. Their positioning was textbook defensive strategy, controlling space, limiting options for further aggression, while maintaining enough distance to avoid any appearance of threatening behavior themselves. The effect on the reunion crowd was immediate and electric. Conversations that had been continuing in hushed whispers throughout the pavilion stopped entirely. I could see relatives at distant tables standing up to get a better view of what was happening, could feel the weight of 65 pairs of eyes focused on our little group with an intensity that made the air feel charged with potential energy. But the most dramatic reaction was from Cassandra herself. I watched my sister's face cycle through surprise, confusion, and then something that looked like genuine fear, as she found herself surrounded by four women, whose bearing and positioning made it clear that they were not impressed by her emotional outburst, and would not tolerate any further physical aggression. "What?" Cassandra started to speak, but Riley's voice cut through whatever protest she'd been planning to make. "Ma'am," Riley said, her tone carrying the kind of quiet authority that could command attention in a combat zone, "I need you to take a step back and consider your actions very carefully." It wasn't a threat. Technically, it wasn't even a command. But everyone who heard it understood that Technical Sergeant Riley Blackstone was not making a request. She was providing what military personnel call professional guidance, in a situation that had moved beyond the realm of acceptable social behavior. Derek Morrison, who had been standing frozen in shock since Cassandra shoved me, finally seemed to process what was happening and moved toward his fiancée with the kind of cautious approach usually reserved for defusing unexploded ordnance. "Cassie, honey, maybe we should." "Don't," Amber said quietly, her voice stopping Derek mid-stride. "Sir, I recommend you maintain your current position until this situation is resolved." The formal politeness of her words somehow made them more intimidating than any shouted command could have been. Derek found himself rooted in place, apparently recognizing that he was completely out of his depth in a situation that had moved far beyond his understanding of appropriate social interaction. My father, who had been watching this entire confrontation with growing alarm, finally found his voice. "Now see here," he began, his tone carrying the kind of paternal authority he'd used to control family situations when I was a child. "This has gone far enough. I won't have violence at a family gathering." That's when Maya turned slightly to address him, her movement so smooth and controlled that it seemed choreographed. "Sir, there's been no violence here. We're simply ensuring that there won't be any. Your daughter pushed a commissioned officer of the United States Air Force in front of witnesses. We're providing a professional response to prevent further escalation." The way she said it, calmly, factually, without emotion or accusation, made Cassandra's shove sound less like a family squabble and more like a serious breach of appropriate conduct. I could see my father processing this reframing, could watch him realize that what he'd interpreted as sibling drama had actually been something much more significant. But it was Rosa who delivered the observation that crystallized everything about what had just happened. She stepped forward slightly, her medical training evident in the way she assessed the situation with clinical precision before speaking. "Captain," she said, addressing me directly while maintaining her position in the protective formation, "are you injured? Do you require medical assessment following the physical assault?" Physical assault. The words hung in the air like a gavel striking wood, formal and final and impossible to misinterpret. What had been framed as an emotional family disagreement was now being described in the precise language of military incident reporting, and everyone present understood the implications. I looked at my sister, standing in the center of a formation of combat veterans who had responded to her aggression with the kind of disciplined professionalism that highlighted just how inappropriate her behavior had been. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with what I realized was the first genuine understanding she'd ever had of who I'd become and who I surrounded myself with. "No, Sergeant Martinez," I replied, my voice carrying across the pavilion with the kind of command presence I'd developed over years of leading personnel in high-stress situations. "I'm not injured, but I appreciate your concern and your team's professional response to the situation." The formal exchange between Rosa and me served multiple purposes. It established that I was unharmed, it documented the incident in military terminology that made its seriousness clear, and it demonstrated the chain of command respect that existed between my squadron sisters and me. For my extended family, many of whom had never seen me in a leadership role, it was probably the first glimpse they'd ever had of Captain Jade Winters in action. Uncle Robert, who had been edging closer during the confrontation, apparently trying to figure out how to insert himself into a situation that had moved completely beyond his understanding, stopped several feet away from our formation. I could see him processing the reality that his niece was not just a woman in uniform, but someone who commanded the kind of loyalty and respect that made 4 decorated veterans instantly willing to stand between her and any perceived threat. Aunt Patricia, meanwhile, looked like she was calculating the social implications of having a family reunion that would be remembered not for its successful organization, but for the moment when the guest of honor was physically attacked by her own sister and protected by her military colleagues. I could practically see her mental damage control protocols activating as she tried to figure out how to salvage the situation. But the most important reaction came from the extended family members who had been watching this entire drama unfold. I could see aunts and uncles, cousins and their spouses processing what they'd just witnessed, not just the push, but the response to it. The coordinated professionalism, the calm authority, the way my squadron sisters had moved to protect me without hesitation or discussion. For people who had probably never seen military personnel in action, who had maybe watched war movies but never witnessed the reality of military bearing and discipline, this was likely their first real understanding of what it meant that I was a captain in the United States Air Force. Not just someone with a job that happened to be in the military, but a leader who had earned the kind of respect that made other highly trained professionals willing to put themselves between me and any threat. Cousin Jennifer, Aunt Patricia's daughter, who had always been one of the more thoughtful family members, was the first to break the stunned silence that had settled over the pavilion. "Cassandra," she said, her voice carrying clearly in the quiet, "I think you owe Jade an apology." It was a simple statement, but coming from someone who had witnessed the entire confrontation and was now looking at my sister with obvious disapproval, it carried significant weight. Other family members began nodding in agreement, and I could see Cassandra realizing that the social dynamics she had tried to manipulate in her favor had turned completely against her. The formation around me maintained its position, my squadron sisters standing at perfect attention while waiting for whatever came next. They weren't intimidating Cassandra. They were simply making it clear that any further aggression would be met with the same coordinated professionalism that had just diffused a potentially explosive situation. And in that moment, surrounded by women who had chosen to stand with me, facing a family that was finally seeing me for who I had become rather than who they remembered, I felt something I had never experienced at a winter's family gathering. I felt completely, authentically myself. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.